Okay, so this is the PC version of Street Fighter Alpha 2, originally released back in 1997, 1998-ish, and added to the GOG.com digital catalog back in November of 2012. This is one of those games I recall really wanting to get my hands on back in the day many moons ago when this thing was brand spanking new, but I ended up never finding a copy, although I did end up snagging the PC version of the original Street Fighter Alpha as something of a consolation prize of sorts, which we'll get into somewhere down the line. Eventually, when this thing came on GOG, I naturally downloaded because I wanted to see how, if it was worth, and anyways, let's just get to the basics. Released as what is either a sequel or a soft reboot of the original Street Fighter Alpha game, but still very much a prequel to the Street Fighter 2 line of video games, that is until the next retcon. Street Fighter Alpha 2 contains 18 fighters, including the original 13 fighters from the first Alpha game, and some new challengers. Well, by new, I mean 2 old Street Fighter 2 mainstays, a former Final Fight boss, an original Street Fighter boss, and newcomer Sakura. In any case, each fighter has the usual array of basic moves, special moves, alpha counters, or zero counters as it's called here for some reason, and super combos of varying power depending on how much super energy you pop into it. Street Fighter Alpha 2's main addition is the custom combo or original combo, where you can go into a combo state and perform various moves in rapid succession for a short burst of time. Much like the previous game, the single-player arcade mode comprises 8 one-on-one battles, with a fixed final opponent depending on your fighter of choice. Sometimes if you perform well enough, you'll fight a hidden rival, and if you do really well, you'll fight Shinakuma, serving more as a penultimate opponent before the final boss, rather than replacing the final boss outright as it was the case in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and Street Fighter Alpha, and I think that covers the basic portion of this session. Yeah, that was kind of a mouthful. For curious parties, the PC version of Street Fighter Alpha 2 is more of a conversion of the PlayStation conversion of the arcade game that was released around the same time or a year before or whatever. Presumably this was done because I don't know why actually. I suppose it doesn't matter one way or another, that is, unless you're interested in playing as hidden characters such as Evil Ryu, Classic Zangief, Classic Dalsim, or extra color palette set Sakura, because they weren't in the PlayStation version. As such, they're not here. But hey, you have Classic Chun-Li, and you have Shinakuma as a hidden character, and you have the original arcade soundtrack as opposed to the remix soundtrack from the PlayStation version, which may or may not be a good thing depending on your mileage. You have the standard arcade mode versus mode, a training mode to try out your moves. By today's standards, this would be considered almost beneath bare bones, but for the time, it was enough for a mid to late 1990s arcade conversion, I suppose. I don't know, I'm fine with it. Sure. The issue with Street Fighter Alpha 2, or at least this version of Street Fighter Alpha 2, comes in terms of control, somewhat. Not necessarily in the sense that you have bad control, because you really don't. Pulling off special moves is quick and easy on the keyboard, a bit blasphemous for some folks, but hey, it's kinda sorta true. And they're responsive enough to get a good groove going, that isn't the real issue. It's the mapping of which keys do what that seems awkward and doesn't seem to work the way it's supposed to. You set up your keys as usual on the option screen, determine which keys your jab, your roundhouse, what goes up, down, left, right, start, select, etc. Straightforward enough, but it really isn't, because once you start playing the game, you begin to realize that the keys you mapped in do not work the way they're supposed to. The key that you map to the medium punch is the 3-punch button in-game, and the key mapped to the fierce punch ends up being the 3-kick button. So it becomes a guessing game to see which keys do what, and it's a hurdle you can figure out and remap in-game so it works the way it's supposed to and to your liking, but it's also quite telling you have to work around a glitched button mapping system that should have worked right out of the box. I assumed originally that this might be due to the keyboard I'm using. I'm using a Logitech wireless keyboard, which is something that probably isn't that common in the late 90s, but reading several reviews seemed like I wasn't in the same boat. It's a common issue. There's gamepad support, but I'd be weary of playing this with a 360 controller for Windows, as you'll be using the stick, the analog stick, rather than the directional pad for motion, which some people might hate, but I don't seem to mind it all that much. Rather, it's the odd button placement that really nibbles here. Most notably, the in-game start and select buttons are mapped to your analog sticks, because the sticks are also buttons. So if you press down the left stick, you'll pause, and that could get pretty annoying when you're trying to pull off the fireball or some other special move, and you start clicking the stick, and it'll pause out of nowhere and it'll break your rhythm. You know, you've probably seen it a couple times already in the footage. You'll have to work your way around that if you wish to use a gamepad or just stick with a keyboard. It actually works quite well when you get it to work the way it's supposed to, if that makes any semblance of sense. As you may or may not be able to tell on screen, Street Fighter Alpha 2 runs at a rather choppy frame rate, almost to the point where smooth moving animation and the like are foreign concepts to this game. Again, I assume this was a hardware thing, but dwelling into other viewpoints viewed otherwise. Although you could set the quality levels and the option to run a somewhat smoother experience, the end result is a much slower moving game. So it's a bit of a trade-off. Do you go for smooth but sluggish or fast but choppy? Neither is a really truly satisfying option, and none of the in-betweens are that much of help either. Setting that aside, Alpha 2 looks fairly close to what you get in the arcade original. It's a bit on the pixelated side of things that you can make out some of the more grainier portions in terms of the shades and the colors. And the graphics in general are not quite as smooth as one would like, but it doesn't look like crap or anything. It looks fairly well for the most part. It looks the part. You know, in that regard, not really going to complain all that much. Sound is pretty much the one area that seems to flow without a hitch. Unlike the PlayStation version that has an arranged soundtrack, the PC port of Alpha 2 uses the original arcade soundtrack, which sounds alright. No, I'm not going to say much more than that. Sound effects and voice samples are of decent quality. Obviously nothing fantastic by today's standards, but decent fare for the time, and it's still pretty good today actually. Not great, but you know, not much more to say in that regard, really, I suppose. Street Fighter Alpha 2, the PC version, is a passable, even somewhat decent conversion of a pretty solid fighting game that plays fairly well enough, but is marred by a number of quibbles such as awkward keyboard mapping, limited gamepad support, choppy frame rate, and the lack of an online component for those who care for that sort of thing. The fact that this is a conversion of a PlayStation port rather than a dedicated arcade translation might be a contributing factor, but I wouldn't call it a total game breaker or anything. At the very least, I can say the game plays well enough and isn't too broken. It's just got a few hiccups here and there that might impede your enjoyment of the overall product. Overall, it's pretty decent fare and it's somewhat fun to a point, but if you're looking for an ideal version of Street Fighter Alpha 2, you would be best served getting your hands on the Street Fighter Alpha Anthology set for PlayStation 2. As far as this PC version goes, I'd say it's alright, and that's fairly high praise on my part.